During the period of absolute chaos in the south, the Eldari Council had been biding their time, centralizing their power, and quietly expanding their influence over the northwest. Their new leader, Vekal Grimm, who inherited the leadership of the Eldari from his father Lumnar, who had won the war against the Orcs and Karpor, worked with the new regions of the Empire to establish a government that would accommodate more people. He ended up establishing the Eldari Council, which had representatives from all over the Empire that would be able to give their opinions and input on different matters. It was not a republic. No council members voted on anything. However, some of these council members would end up becoming incredibly powerful. The establishment of this council would, for at least in the near future, quell any threat of revolt from newly conquered people, namely the Porians, who still had the memory of their Karpor Empire in mind. Much of the politics of the Eldari Council would circle around trying to keep the Porians happy living under Eldari banners, and this would eventually become a pattern of behavior between the two cultures. One of the first things that the council decided to do was re-establish Sargenta as a vassal state under the Eldari Council. But really quick, first a word from our sponsor, Grimmer RP. Welcome to Grimmer RP, a Minecraft server where you can found towns, fight wars via the Nodes plugin, inspired by provinces and Paradox and grand strategy games such as Universalis and Hearts of Iron. Embark on voyages with their vehicles, such as cruiser ships and entire zeppelins. Explore towns brimming with history and tales, crafted by their own community. You can engage in exhilarating combat, arm your soldiers with guns, artillery, flamethrowers, and even more. Join them now and forge your legacy in Grimmer RP, launching December 15th at grimmerrp.com or discord.gg/grimmer. Thank you all. Sargenta had been a major ally of the Eldari during the crisis with the Porians and the Orcs, and wanted to show them that they weren't here to conquer them too. Sargenta was given a unique place on the council, given that they weren't actually a province of the Empire. Vekal wanted to ensure the support of Sargenta, which could help keep the Porians living there look at the Eldari with a better light. But the Empire was big, and the need for resources was growing. Landlass, the small Palmer nation to their north, had stayed neutral in the war before. Shortly after the establishment of the council, soldiers traveled to the king of Landlass and simply asked if Landlass wanted protection. Landlass seemed to know what they really meant, and allowed Eldari troops to station there. With the submission of Landlass, the Eldari strategy of dominating the northwestern resource trade would begin. Landlass being under their control would at least give them a leg up on the rest of the Palmer tribes, Langmaskust and Palmerstad. Palmerstad being the largest and with the most opportunity to cause issues. The Eldari decided to focus on Langmaskust first, even though they were rather far away. The chief of Langmaskust was offered extremely competitive prices on tin extradition, and began to cut off Palmerstad from their market, refusing to buy their tin. Vekal worked out a deal with the chief of Langmaskust to establish an Eldari troop presence there so that the chief could disband his own army. As the people there grew more and more rich, without the need to worry about defense and the plentiful coin flowing through the tin market, the tribe of Palmerstad grew poorer and poorer, unable to find trade partners for their tin exports. Palmerstad has in effect been checkmated, and finally negotiated with the Eldari. Due to their initial resistance to the Eldari expansionism, the people of Palmerstad were not given the same deal as those of Langmaskust, and Eldari merchants freely mined the tin themselves within their country, under the eye of the Eldari military presence. In the meantime, the chief of Curacone in the south felt an immediate need to gain military strength after witnessing the rise of the Braga Empire, which could have wiped him out if they had wanted to, and now witnessing the aggressive nature of Eldari expansionism. But Chief Iko would immediately find himself in a precarious position when his army was destroyed by the first neighboring tribe he tried to invade, Unlustig. Iko was forced into keep rebuilding and restructuring his army until he had finally conquered the tribe. However, the Eldari Eldari were watching close, and began to start funneling money into those who would rise up against their new Curasone overlords. Eventually, even other neighboring tribes that shared the same culture and language as Curasone began to receive money from the Eldari to raid their neighbor. Chief Iko desperately fought off increasingly stronger and stronger raids, and eventually, the tribe that he had fought so hard to subjugate, Unlustig, rose back up in rebellion, killing the local garrison, and inviting Eldari troops into the nation. Iko was no longer in control over the majority of his own country, and attempted to flee, but was captured by rebel and Eldari forces in the city of Curasone, presumably killed or sent to prison all the way up in the Eldari capital of Stendari. The region was formed into a new province of the Eldari Council, and ironically, the tribal leadership of Unlustig was put in charge of the new province and added to the council. More and more, it became clear to those in the northwest that even lifting a finger to the Eldari will spell the end for you, and submission is the only real way to keep peace. But Iko and his tribe's spirit would live on, if just for a little longer. In the far north of the country, the Palmer people were all finally secured, and the flow of tin was faster than ever. At this point, the Eldari wanted to push how far they could really go to increase the tin production. One of the Eldari queens on the council, Karna of Lunari, wanted to expand even farther northward, and sent a small group of settlers to establish a new tin mining colony. The colony would end up being called Lorethil. Those who settled there became rich tin barons, bringing more and more people to settle there to try to make a quick buck. Karna herself became one of the richest people on the planet, driving interest even farther. More and more settlers would eventually travel to the province and colony, and what they would find would end up changing the course of history. Immediately, many of the miners heading east began to just never return. Some of them would come back with harrowing stories of monsters hunting the travelers there, a warning that would go mostly ignored. The people on this planet already shared it with horrifying creatures that had their own kingdoms and nations, so monsters on the other side of some faraway mountain range weren't all too surprising. Though suddenly, the Empire would come to a crashing halt, not caused by monsters, but a rebellion. After the Curasone people were conquered, the Eldari Council soon passed the Solar Act, which on paper was a charitable state-sponsored fund to build monasteries around the Empire. But in practice, it was a way for the Eldari to impose their religion upon all of the recently conquered people. The Eldari worshipped a strange religion that made out the moon to be its deity. There isn't a whole lot of information about this early Eldari religion, but moon worship was essentially now being enforced upon hundreds of thousands. The Porians, who worshipped a multitude of religions, were the main target of this law, many of them following Zenubius's mysterious dark religion even long after his passing. The Porians had long been a sore in the sight of the Eldari elite. They're having a huge population, and the majority of them living directly in the core of the Empire. The fever for their own empire still lives on in the older people's thoughts. To the Eldari, making the Porians submit to Eldari culture is of utmost importance. But the Porians were proud and hated the Eldari. Many of the monasteries that were being built through the Solar Act were simultaneously attacked, leading to many moon worshippers to be killed. One particular case saw a group of Porians assaulted by Eldari troops in the city of Bowen, who were yelling profanity at the workers building the monastery, which acted like a straw that broke the camel's back. The city of Bowen went up in flames as rioters killed and threw out any and all Eldari troops in the city. Soon after, the entire Porian core was in revolt against Eldari and their religious posturing, and a new Porian state had a new face, and his name was Captain Fledger, who organized tens of thousands of militia to meet the Eldari in their expected response. This rebellious militia trained for months, preparing for the Eldari to attack with their main army. But strangely enough, the Eldari were nowhere to be seen for months, and the rebellion became a functioning republic within the Eldari Council. Interestingly, Loon, the council member responsible for sponsoring the Solar Act, would later have his own crisis, finding out that his family originally hail from Poria itself. To an Eldari man, this is the worst news you could ever learn about yourself, and he soon disappeared from the council. Many more weeks would go by, and still no response from the Eldari. Captain Fledger began to grow anxious. Even though his army got stronger by the day, it was weak in quality, and he feared that the Eldari might be biding their time to amass an army so large they could destroy the Porian people for good. But instead, he began to hear reports that the Eldari army had been moving south from Lorethil, and that they had suffered some sort of military defeat. Captain Fledger began to wonder if his rebellion had inspired others, and that the Eldari may be dealing with a much larger rebellion. Finally, when the Eldari army arrived in the Porian core, they only arrived with roughly 15,000 soldiers, compared to the Porian Revolt's 27,000. But the Porian army was made up of mostly unskilled militia, and when the battle-hardened Eldari army attacked the city of Bowen, the rebel army was destroyed, and Captain Fledger was killed. Looking back, both Chief Eco of Curacone and Captain Fledger of the Porian Revolt were the last two men to put up a fight against the expanding Eldari when it seemed like nothing could stop them, while the rest of the world, many with much more fighting capabilities, just sat and watched as the world was set in a new direction against their will. These characters' names are not really known to anybody in the community anymore, and I would bet that not even the two players who played them, one having been gone from the server for years now, would even really remember that they existed either. Quietly in the east, Pyotsev and Artswale had been building their own power blocks to rival that of Eldari. I have been a little bit more quiet than I should have about these powers, but unfortunately they didn't fit in very well into the overarching story. They formed an alliance with each other, both acquired massive amounts of land through expanding through their neighbors, and both simultaneously built sizably large vassal states, bringing their influence to a massive scale. During this time, Pyotsev's plan on how to deal with the Eldari was to stay quiet and lay low, and hopefully an opportunity would present itself to destroy them. But through the Porian Revolt, they all stayed quiet, and instead, it would be a much different name that people would remember in the future for fighting the Eldari and challenging the world's status quo. Captain Fledger had gotten one thing right and one thing wrong in his assessment of the Eldari reaction to the revolt. They had been dealing with something else at the same time, though it wasn't more rebellion like he had hoped. Rather, an invasion from across those mysterious mountains. Rumors were spreading that those monsters that miners had discovered were ravaging the countryside of Palmer, Langmaskust, and Lorethil, and burning the cities of all the tribes in the northeast. Many of the local Eldari garrisons were obliterated in the initial attack, keeping the flow of correct information slow. But eventually, some survivors made it back to Stendari, and informed Vekkel of what was truly going on. They were monsters, sort of. This was an invasion of beast men, half horse and half man, who called themselves the Ricolians, and their king, Azulis, demanded Emperor Vekkel's immediate surrender.